On Twitter yesterday, there was a guy who left a comment, a former federal government official. He goes by the handle Marek VR at M. Von Ren. He says, I worked at the Pentagon. And this is with regard to the Roswell situation. He doesn't believe that there's any way that that could have been kept secret. He says, I worked at the Pentagon. It's virtually impossible for a report of this scope and depth to be a cover-up. Perhaps the cultural/operational blowback and bureaucratic pain of the Roswell incident explains some of the Air Force's reluctance to engage on UAP. That's laughable. Laughable. You're going to tell me that if something is classified as above top secret, which there's no question in my mind, Roswell would have been above top secret, as well as the keeping secret the reality that there's extraterrestrial presence on Earth, okay? That would be above, all of that would be above top secret. We know this. We know this. There's people who work at NASA, okay? There's people who work at NASA that they're told they can't, whenever there's UFOs and stuff like that, that's not, you can't tell the public about that. That's been a policy there for many decades, okay? Airline pilots, they're not allowed to talk about it. If they do, they lose their jobs. That's been a policy for decades. That's because the government, the Pentagon, they don't want anyone to talk about this or let anyone in the public know about any kind of UFO encounters. It's always hushed up and covered up. And we know this because there's been different people in the military that's come forward throughout the years, the stuff that does leak through. But Roswell, the government, they did a pretty good job on covering that one up. And there's other cases they've covered up over the years, too. Apparently, in 1941, there was a alleged crash. Now, I mean, there's not as much information with this crash as there was with Roswell of 1947. But here's a little piece on that. This was the Cape Girardeau, Missouri case. When in 1941 something apparently crashed, and there was a handful of witnesses there, and there was a picture taken. Unfortunately, the picture went missing after years. But I'll read a little bit. This is off the UFO Casebook.com website. I will leave a link for it. But it says here, one of the most mysterious stories of a crashed UFO and alien bodies preceded the well-known Roswell event by some 6 years. The case was first brought to investigators by Leo Stringfield in his book UFO Crash Retrievals, The Inner Sanctum. He opened a tantalizing account of a military-controlled UFO crash retrieval, which is still being researched today. The details of the case were sent to him in a letter from one Charlotte Mann, who related her minister grandfather's deathbed. Well, actually, her grandmother's. That's a mistake here. It was her grandmother's deathbed confession of being summoned. Of her grandfather being summoned. Her grandmother actually told her, Charlotte Mann, in the early 1980s, just before she died, of her minister grandfather's being summoned back in 1941 to pray over an alien crash victims outside of Cape Girardeau, Missouri. And his name was Rev William Huffman, and he had been an evangelist for many years, but had taken the resident minister reins of the Red Star Baptist Church in early 1941. Church records corroborate his employment there during this period in question. After receiving this call to duty, he was immediately driven the 10 to 15 mile journey to some woods outside of town. Upon arriving at the scene of the crash, he saw policemen, fire department personnel, FBI agents, and photographers already mulling through the wreckage. He was soon asked to pray over 3 dead bodies. As he began to take in the activity around the area, his curiosity was first struck by the sight of the craft itself. Expecting a small plane of some type, he was shocked to see that the craft was disc-shaped, and upon looking inside, he saw hieroglyphic-like symbols indecipherable to him. He then was shown the 3 victims, not human as expected, but small alien bodies with large eyes, hardly a mouth or ears, and hairless. Immediately after performing his duties, he was sworn to secrecy by military personnel who had taken charge of the crash area. He witnessed these warnings being given to others at the scene also. As he arrived back at his home, he was still in a state of mild shock and could not keep his story from his wife Flo and his sons. This late-night family discussion would spawn the story that Charlotte Mann would hear from her grandmother in 1984 as she lay dying of cancer at Charlotte's home while undergoing radiation therapy. Charlotte was told the story over the span of several days, and although Charlotte had heard bits and pieces of the story before, she now demanded the full details. As her grandmother tolerated her last few days on this earth, Charlotte knew it was now or never to find out everything she could before this intriguing story was lost with her death of her grandmother. She also learned that one of the members of her grandfather's congregation, thought to be Garland Frauenberger, had given him a photograph taken on the night of the crash. This picture was of one of the dead aliens being helped up by two men. Charlotte Mann gave, in her own words, an account of what she knew for a television documentary. Some of the account, which then she gives this account, you have to read, it's a pretty long account. But basically, this Charlotte Mann had claimed to actually see this picture, but somebody in the family, a family friend named, some guy named Fisk, apparently Walter Wayne Fisk, had requested the picture. He wanted to see it, and he never returned it. And then when investigators tried to contact this person about he wouldn't give them any information. It's very unfortunate. It would have been, if they would have had that picture, that could have been a smoking gun, perhaps. Probably not, because I'm sure people would say it was fake anyhow. But regardless, it would have been neat to see that picture, if in fact it existed. But I mean, this is another incident where, if this story is true, there's just not a lot of information on it. There has been some books written about it. It's very interesting, but it's just there's not nearly as much of corroboration for this as there is for the Roswell incident. But it would be nice if there was more to this than we have. But again, it sounds like it's par for the course, though. I mean, government officials showing up saying, "Hey, you can't talk about this. This is a secret, national security, blah blah blah." Same thing with Roswell. It doesn't seem like there were any death threats made to anybody here, like in Roswell. But there were, people were told basically not to say anything. I'm just trying to understand, though, in 1941, how strange something like this must have seemed. Would you know? I mean, like, say you show up at a crash site in 1941, and there's bodies in a flying saucer. I mean, at that time, nobody talked about flying saucers. Flying saucers didn't become a thing until 1947. Now, of course, there were UFOs before 1947, but it wasn't they weren't as prevalent. They weren't as noticed as much until 47. I mean, apparently all through, these things have been documented through the centuries, actually. I mean, there's ancient times, as from what we could tell. But it wasn't really until 47 where we really start taking notice. But then again, that could have something to do with the fears of the Cold War. So people were, checking the skies a little bit more because there was a fear of attack from Russia by this point. But you have to try to imagine. Say this is true. This story. Seeing alien bodies in 1941. Like how? Like you're trying to. It'd be so hard to trying to wrap your mind around it at that time. I mean, you just never heard of anything like this before. I mean, did they even, at first, when you look at this, I mean, maybe you're thinking, well, maybe they're just foreigners and they're just, this is what, what would you be thinking? Maybe there's people that actually look like this somewhere in the world and we didn't know about it at first. I mean, you wouldn't be able to really believe that there's something from outer space that's coming here. But I'm sure that if this story was true, I'm sure that at some point the government would have had to come to a conclusion. Oh, well, I guess there's things from outer space coming here. But again, there's just not enough information. There's not enough. This story is very difficult to corroborate. I mean, it's not like the Roswell story where there was a lot of different witnesses. Here, there was a handful of witnesses, if that. And they're all secondhand, thirdhand sources. Okay, I guess the point of this is if this is real, obviously no one heard about it until the 80s, and they didn't come out. Nobody really talked about this until years later. So yeah, I guess things could be covered up. The government could keep secrets. They obviously kept secrets at Roswell. To this day, they're still keeping secrets. And I want to say one more thing. About 16 or 17 years ago, I was at a Halloween party. and I don't care. I'll talk about this now, but there was somebody there that was a retired CIA operative. And this person told me, well, of course, as you could probably imagine, someone like me, when you're around someone like me, that's the topic of UFOs is, very likely to pop up. And obviously it popped up in this conversation I was having with this retired CIA guy. And he didn't say anything outright, right? He didn't say, but he said yes. He indicated that yes, there's something. He made it sound like yes, there's something extraterrestrial behind it. So obviously this guy seemed to know something, unless he was just lying to me, right? But who knows? I guess I just want to throw that out there. But again, this guy on Twitter. Okay, and there's a lot of people on Twitter like this. I mean, there seems I've been noticing a lot, and a lot of these people post in UFO Twitter and UAP Twitter. A lot of these people just can't help themselves. A lot of people that don't believe in this kind of thing, who either are debunkers or they're useful idiots or they're who knows what they are. Okay. But they can't help themselves. They have to get the word out there that there's no way that's possible. You couldn't cover something like this up, and or that it's not as fantastic as a lot of people make it sound, and there's like some sort of effort, it seems, that's been going on Twitter by certain people, or maybe they're all working in concert with each other. Between debunkers, between some former government officials like this guy, apparently, there's an effort out there to try to make make this thing sound reasonable, that there's no such thing as extraterrestrials, and if there is, it's not as fantastic as some people make it sound. Well, I don't know what they're talking about. Okay, I don't know what they're trying to accomplish here. Now, this guy, he goes on, he has a couple other tweets here, too. He goes on about Roswell. He says, the sheer amount of documentary evidence, logs, diagrams, personal journals, key interviews, etc., along with the fact that other Project Mogul equipment was recovered by ranchers around Roswell in June 1947, make it extremely difficult for me to believe it's a 75-year cover-up. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, buddy, but... here's the thing. There were balloons that were found by people out there sometimes, right? They were balloons, and they would contact the Air Force as, hey, there's some balloons out here in Atlanta, and the Air Force would come and retrieve them. But you had officials like Jesse Marcel, right? Who was the guy was the top intelligence officer there at the Roswell Air Base. He was a top intelligence guy. You're going to say that he couldn't differentiate between a balloon and something from outer space, a metal, right? It's totally bogus. It's like this guy. They make comments online. They don't research anything. They don't read books. They don't. They'll go by the Air Force report, or they'll go on to the Skeptical Inquirer and read something by Joe Nickel or Michael Shermer. I mean, and then go, and that's what they believed in. And those guys, they never did any research on this, not any real research. There were no witnesses to a balloon. I mean, there were so many people that saw either fragments of it or bodies or both. And there was lots of second and third hand witnesses on top of that to Roswell. And then the guy goes on. He says, nor is there mention, this is a good one here, I like this one, nor is there mention of the June 14th, 1947 incident by signed, grudge, blue book, or any other contemporaneous documents. Roswell only became a story 3 decades later. It wasn't June 14th anyhow. It was in July. It was early July when this happened, okay? Well, I don't know where he's getting June 14th from. But anyway, he said, it goes on, it's surprising the United States Air Force is reluctant to re-engage on UAP, but also a good example of Congress moving the needle. But anyway, going on with regard to what's he saying here about that Roswell didn't appear in signed, grudge, or blue book. Okay, there obviously the situation with Roswell had to be classified above all those things. People that were part of signed, grudge, blue book, they didn't have access to Roswell. Obviously had to be put in the hands of a very small elite group. That was it. If you're going to keep that secret, then you can't talk about it. And all those soldiers, right? A lot of different soldiers, right, had over the, during the investigation into this in the 80s and the 90s. A lot of these people, most of them are dead now. I think probably all of them are dead now. A lot of people, gave their little segment of the story, and a lot of them said they saw this or they saw that. They saw bodies. Some of them were part of the crews that had to go out to the desert more than once to clean up the wreckage that was scattered over a vast area, and it wasn't balloon material. If it was balloon material, there's no way the Air Force would have made such a big deal about this back then. And in fact, the guy, Walter Haut, the guy who sent out the original press release, he was told to send out the original press release to say that it was a flying saucer. And then later on, they changed that to say, no, it wasn't. They said it was a weather balloon. But he signed an affidavit several years before he died, a sworn affidavit saying that it was from outer space. He said he saw the stuff. He saw bodies. So these people just don't do their research. So all they'll do is they'll sit back and say, well, he's obviously lying. Well, why would you lie? Why would you sign an affidavit like 5 or 6 years before you die, not to be released until after your death? Why would you do something like that? Sign something like that. Why would you do that? That doesn't make. Why would anybody on their deathbed make statements like this? And there's a lot of deathbed. It wasn't just him. There's multiple deathbed confessions, and a lot of them are actually. You'll find them in Roswell, The Ultimate Cold Case Closed, by Donald Schmidt and Thomas Carey, right? If you were to read that book, there's a lot of different deathbed confessions that they've compiled from different people that played some part in that whole Roswell situation. Again, people, it's just maddening. It's maddening that Roswell is just basically treated like it's like a joke by so many different people without any knowledge. It's like this guy, it just doesn't make any sense. Like this person here on Twitter, and there's a lot of them. They're all over the place. It's just so upsetting, that people are just like, again, I don't know what the purpose of this is. Like, okay, my opinion is I don't believe it, right? You think these skeptics, they're people who, I don't know. They don't want to believe this, and they want to make sure that their beliefs are, you believe me, or you're dumb if you don't. It's actually you're dumb. You're the one who's dumb, right? For not doing the research. Do all the research. Weigh the evidence. Don't just sit there and read something out of the skeptoid, right? And then just, that's what happened. Get the other books. Get the other data that's out there. Do your own research. How could you just go by what the Air Force is telling you? There's more to Roswell. There is more to Roswell. People need to wake up and look into this. Stop making fools out of yourselves on Twitter with this. You do some research, and then you would know. I mean, anybody who was to do this research would most certainly, if you were to do the research on this, you would most certainly walk away with a different understanding. You couldn't deny it. It's hard to how could you deny it after you read it? You had multiple people coming right out. There was no witnesses to a balloon in this situation. None.